So today we're going to talk about noses. Now, if you look at a nose, Scher's iconic nose, you'll notice that it's basically a cylinder. There's a sphere right here, and then there's another sphere here, and another sphere here. Again, you look at this pretty girl's nose, there's a cylinder. This is like the visible part of a sphere. There's another visible part of a sphere. If you look at the lines of this nose, there's a line here, 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 and that's it. There aren't any lines here or here. There's value differentiation here and here, but no lines. So if we look at any of these people's noses, same. There are darker shadows here, but the only lines we see are at the bottom of the nose. So if we draw Scher's iconic nose, if we're doing a line study of the nose, then you'll see it's basically outside lines and then nostrils, and then maybe you'll see the bottom of the nose. There might be another line here on some people's noses and another line here. Even if and that's if you're just doing lines. Maybe this is a little longer, like on Scher's nose, that's a little bit longer. And then these lines are a little bit heavier. But that's your line study. If you're doing a shape study of a nose, you're going to have basically a cylinder with the top cut off of it. So it's a cylinder. So you've got shading like this. You might have the shadow that's cast by the cylinder on both sides. You're going to have essentially a sphere at the bottom of the cylinder. Then you're going to have another sphere here. And another sphere here. And we want to kind of get these spheres the same size before we start adding any detail. So this sphere, you can shade it like a sphere, but it kind of gets cut off a little bit, and so do these. So the actual line of the nose overlapping these spheres starts inside this sphere, goes up, down, inside this sphere. So really, when you're looking at the nose, and then the other thing to be aware of is that the outside edge of this sphere does not touch that inside line. So that's the little crease next to the nose, and then it usually goes up a little bit. This is indicated by shading, not line. And then this will also be mostly indicated by shading and not line. So there's shading here, here, and then you'll have the shading underneath for the Cupid's bow. And then your nostrils, another important thing to notice about them is that these lines, like I said, don't touch, but the upper edge of the nostril is defined. The lower edge is not defined. It's a soft edge. So if I go do a little bit of smudging on this nose that I just drew, if I use one of my smudging sticks, then I want to soften up that line for sure. I want to soften up this. I'll probably more or less get rid of this top edge of the sphere, because if your light's coming at an angle down, you probably won't see that. It'll maybe be a little bit defined by some shadows on the side. And then for the most part, sides of this will be in the shadow That'll be softened up. And then the shadow down here will probably be also softened up. Here is a gap. There's those two lines don't meet. So now if we do this with the reductive drawing technique that we learned, we're gonna shade an area for our nose. You don't want to go too dark when you do the shading either. You want to get about a medium gray when you're done with it. So shade it, blend it, kind of try to get it more or less even. And I'm going to define those edges. So the bigger, let's look at a different nose for this one. Oh, there's a lot of noses to pick from in this magazine. Let's look at her nose. Also, the angle that you look at the nose is going to make a difference. But let's look at her nose for this photo, for this drawing. So there's the sphere. So there's the sphere. Her sphere is a little bit longer. It's more oblong. This sphere is the same height, whereas on Cher's one it was a little bit lower. Here it's the same height, and it's a little bit taller, also a little bit oblong. This one's a little bit oblong. And then the top part of her nose is almost more like a cone than a cylinder. So I'm going to kind of roughly draw that in. Nothing is strongly defined. Now, when I'm comfortable with these being the same size, I can always go and alter them a little bit. Then I can start doing my shading. So this is going to my medium. This is more or less my medium too. My medium black. My outside of this outer edge of this nostril comes down and in. Those are my only lines here on the outer edge of the nose. So outer edge on the right, my outer edge on the left doesn't look exactly the same, so I'm going to go fix that. I might have to do some erasing, but just for the sake of this, I'll just thicken up the other side. So that's my outer edge. She doesn't have a very defined crease here. If she did, I'd draw that in, but for this one, I'm actually going to soften it up. I'm going to use my smudge stick to soften up this whole. You can see the tonal difference there. So she has a slight light spot over here. So I'll add that in with an eraser. There's a little bit of a darker edge at the bottom here. And it goes a little bit darker around the top and the sides. So I'm going to actually add some of that darker areas in. Use my willow charcoal for that. So just lightly darken up this and this. Use my smudge stick to blend that. Blend that. She's got a little bit of a darker spot over here too. I'm just focusing on the nose right now. I'm not going to draw the eye too much, but just to suggest that. I'm going to soften up that line. And then, oops, I'm also going to use my kneaded eraser to kind of slightly lighten up this front edge of the nose. And then there is a tip of lightness on her nose. So I'm gonna fill that in. You can see that the dark kind of goes around in a little bit more, so I'm gonna leave that like that. Maybe define that shiny spot on her nose a little bit better. Then I'm gonna use my I want to soften this. That line isn't that stark, so I'm going to soften that up too a little bit. It's more of a shadow on her than it is a line. Soften that shadow up. Maybe draw it up a little bit and down. And then I'm going to use this marker and I'm going to define the upper. So that's where the nose meets the bottom. I'm going to define the upper edges of her nostrils. So they go up and in. And this is not a circle. It looks kind of like a lasso. So there we go. And now I'm not going to define this middle line because it's not defined in the picture. I will add a little bit of shading over here and over here. And then I'm going to actually lighten up her Cupid's bow by removing with my eraser. And I'm gonna use my charcoal, my willow charcoal, to darken up that spot right there. And now I'm gonna use my blending stick to soften up the bottoms of her nostril shadows because they're not defined. The top is, the top's a sharp edge, the bottom is not. So there we have it, the nose. Hopefully that's a little bit clearer than the demonstration I gave in the class.